Okay,
Can everyone please be sure to mute?
okay. Vince, is that up and running now?
It is, Tom.
Okay.
Don't
So
mute me, Tom.
go ahead. I'd like to make this pretty interactive. If you have questions, let's start by entering them in the chat box, and Vince will interrupt as appropriate. At the end, we can certainly talk about anything that you want. So I want to talk tonight about getting set for the shot. And what I want to focus on tonight is some of the nits and grits of what a camera is and how to use it, but primarily how that informs your creative side. So, you prepared and you planned for a shoot. You probably envisioned what images you want to capture, and now you're out there or you're in the area. The moment's arising, and your skills of your camera should be second nature, or you may miss the shot. And there it is. The shot's there, and the question is, are you ready? So I want you to think about photographing with intent. Today's cameras are really amazing instruments, and they try and make everything easy for you. So there's a lot of automation. And almost anyone can take an image, and that's fun, but there's limited satisfaction. Cameras capture images, but photographers make photographs. You've probably heard that before, but it's really what I want to focus on a little bit tonight is making a photograph. So, the technology won't make you a great photographer. The interaction between you and the camera is what creates the photographs, and wonderful images come through your intent, okay, and how you interact with your camera to meet that intent. So what I want to focus on tonight is understanding the machine that is your camera and how that informs your creative intent. So familiarity with your camera allows that creativity to emerge. I don't want you to be confused or be thinking about technical aspects when you really should be focused on, the creativity of what you intend your image to be. And if you understand the camera and understand the technology behind it, at least to the point that you know how to manipulate it to meet your intent, you begin to see in a different manner. We'll begin to talk tonight a little bit about exposure modes, the P, the A, the S, the M, the auto up there on the mode dial. We'll talk about focus and metering modes, a little bit about shutter speed and options, and any other special modes that you might want to bring to my attention. And the key thing is keep the camera in your hand and take shots, experiment, test your intent against various camera setups. The more you take charge of what your camera is doing, the more creative your photography. And a lot of that comes with just playing around and understanding the settings and looking at what happens when you use those different settings. So knowing the camera frees you to get creative. And more importantly, I think it allows you to begin to envision the possibilities when you move into a scene or are going out for a shoot. So we'll review tonight and I hope gain some understanding of exposures and how aperture, shutter, and ISO interact. It may be basic to some people, but it may not be to others. And I think you can always pick up something. We'll look at the automated modes, aperture priority, shutter priority, auto ISO, what the program mode means and other focus modes. And we'll look at the really powerful tools in the camera, metering, histograms, and exposure compensation. So for each, we'll discuss the impact that they have and how they would impact your artistic or creative intent. Hopefully that will enable your photographic creation, and ultimately it's you that are making the settings. At least I hope so. And that's going to tell the story that the photo presents and that meets your intent. So I'm a retired system engineer, spent a lot of years doing system work, and I always kind of like to look at what is the system when we talk about making a photograph. If you can see up here, so this is the way I look at it. There's a light source, whether it's the sun, inside, whatever it is, it illuminates the subject. The light coming from the subject is captured by the lens. Then you have an aperture, and the aperture controls the amount of light entering into the camera. The shutter controls the amount of time that light enters into the camera. It impinges on the sensor, which converts it into a digital readout. There is some gain applied to the sensor to make it either more sensitive or less sensitive. The information is stored, and then it goes into post-processing. And the reason I look at this is because you begin to look at it and see what are the controls on this and what is the camera doing. So I don't want to get too geeky, but it helps to see all this, okay? Because you have direct control on the camera. You have the aperture, you can control the aperture, you can control the shutter, you can control the gain, that's what the ISO is. You can control focus, and you can control, in sometimes, the lens, or at least the focal length of the lens. You have indirect control over the light source. You have light modifiers, you have indirect control over the subject, and you have indirect control over the composition. So we're going to focus on some of those things you have direct control on, and how to manipulate each one to meet your intent. So today's cameras are relatively simple, right? I mean, you can really intuitively grasp everything you see there. I'm kidding, people. So this is the back. This is what my camera, an Olympus, shows on the back of the screen. I mean, there's 30 some icons there that would kind of snow you if you wanted to try and pay attention to each one and understand it. What I want you to gain tonight is a little bit of the understanding what's behind all these, so when you see some of them, you begin to understand and you begin to intuit exactly what's going to happen with what you do. So let's start with exposure. What's a correct exposure? I don't think there's any exact answer to this. It depends. And my definition, what I use a lot, is you capture sufficient information from the subject to meet your intent. Now that can be more or less photons, it can be brighter or darker, it all depends on what your intent is, but you capture sufficient information. So, digital cameras use a sensor composed of individual pixels that capture those photons into a two-dimensional spatial map. And that's really what's important. I gotta move this so I can see better here. There we go. So, see, I got to go back one. I got a little ahead of myself. So what I want to look at to begin with here is a little bit of this analogy over here on the right side of the screen. If we take how the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO interact to change and control the exposure, we can begin by looking like each pixel on the frame on the sensor is a light bucket that's capturing photons. And an empty bucket would be black and a full bucket would be white. You have three controls for filling the bucket. So you can consider the intensity of the light as pressure in this little example. And you begin to look at the aperture as the size of the pipe that the light is flowing into the sensor, into the pixel with. So the size of the aperture controls how much water is coming in, how much light is coming into this example. So the aperture is the size of the pipe. The shutter then is like a valve that's either opening and closing and letting in water in this example, or light from the subject. And that's the speed, the amount of time that shutter or the valve is open. And then the sensor gain, which is a little counterintuitive, but the higher the ISO, the smaller the bucket. So in that sense, if you remember, empty is black and full is white, the higher the ISO, the fewer photons needed to get to white. All right. So sensor gain is the size of the bucket. So correct exposure then is sufficient light in enough pixels to meet your intent. If you overfill the bucket, okay, you're losing information. That's overexposure. Hang on a second, I have to move my, all your faces are covering up some of my screen. So if you overfill the bucket, you're going to lose information, and if you don't have enough information in the bucket, you may lack information, which is underexposure. So that's kind of the interplay in exposure between these three controls: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm going to move through this relatively quickly, so if you have questions, type them out.
Tom, excuse me.
Go ahead.
With that comment, you can change the view that you have in the upper right to just you, but there is a question in regard to the sensor. and pixel pickup, are there separate sensors for red, green, and blue, or is there one sensor that has different filters to let the sensors pick up each of the colors?
Yeah, there's actually, I think on most cameras anyway, digital cameras these days, there's one sensor, but there's actually different filters over the sensor. Do I have that right? Actually, it doesn't make a lot of difference, except that when you get to the histogram, you can take a look. And in most histograms displays on a camera, you can see the red, blue, and the green. And you want to be careful that you don't oversaturate one of those colors. Like if you were looking at a red flower, while the meter may show an average, and we'll get into this a little bit, the red could be saturated. So the answer is it's all integrated into the sensor itself. And I'll get back to you with an exact answer. I honestly don't remember whether there's actually three individual pixels behind each of the red, blue, and green filters, or whether there's one filter, or there's three filters on top of, well, there has to be three different pixels, come to think of it. But I'll get back to you with a little more detail on that.
Okay.
But I think the key thing is, don't worry too much about the depth of it right here, is getting enough information onto the sensor to capture your intent. And in that sense, those three controls relate to each other in terms of affecting exposure. They also each control, and what you'll see talked about is the exposure triangle, where here on the left image, you have aperture on the left side of the triangle, shutter on the right side in green, and the ISO or gain in the bottom in purple. And you'll see them related this way. And we'll talk about each one of them because they each have a different effect on what kind of image, how they affect the image that you take. The other thing I wanted to emphasize a little bit, how these controls work together. I didn't talk about this in great detail, but there's been kind of there's been a convention called stops, or exposure stops, where each increment, full increment in either the aperture, the shutter, or the ISO doubles the amount of effect, or halves the amount of effect, depending which way you're going. So they're all laid out that way. If you noticed, shutter speed typically goes by powers of 2 or powers by 1/2, up or down. The aperture, while these funny numbers, we'll talk about those in a minute, actually increase the amount of light coming through the circle that's the aperture by twice or by half. So it's actually a square law, since you're talking about the area of the circle or the aperture coming in. And the ISO also goes by powers of 2. So if you're looking to the right here in this triangle on the right, if you look at the little circle, if that's the correct exposure, you can't just go anywhere within this space, okay, and be able to have any exposure and expect it to be the same. They all interrelate very specifically. So if we look at this dot right here, and we follow the purple line down, it says it's ISO of 1600. The aperture is 2.8, okay, and the shutter speed is 1/30th. If I wanted to drop if I wanted to increase my shutter speed, say, and I wanted to go to 125, I would have to come over, let's see, let me get this right. I would come over on this line if I kept 2.8. If I kept the aperture at 2.8, I'd come over to 125. Well, that's decreasing, right? It's shortening the shutter time it's open, which means you're letting in less light. So I'm going to have to, am I getting this right? Where am I? Then I'm going to have to come down, the dot's moved over to here, I'm going to have to come down, increase my gain because I have less light to get the same exposure. While I decreased the shutter speed by 2 stops, I had to increase the gain by 2 stops. And you can move in any direction on any line if you want. So if I wanted to increase the aperture or decrease the aperture to 5.6, then I'd come over to this point as one example. If I wanted to keep the same, oops, there we go. If I wanted to keep the same ISO right here, Vince, can you see my cursor moving?
Yes.
Okay, so if this is the point, if I wanted to go up to 5.6 and I wanted to keep at this exposure, then I'd come up, if I kept the ISO the same as 1600, then I had to increase my shutter time to 1/8 from a 30th. So that's how the exposure triangle interrelates. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So let's start with each side of the triangle. If we talk about the ISO and we talk about how that affects your envisioning of the image you're taking, ISO refers to the sensitivity or the gain of the camera sensor. It doesn't capture any more, the sensor itself doesn't capture any more photons. It's like turning up the volume on an amplifier, turning up the volume on your TV. The information is there, it's just getting amplified. So if you go to a higher ISO, you're amplifying the amount of photons, the photon signal the sensor is collecting. In other words, a smaller bucket, meaning fewer photons, gets you to white. Okay? So the downside of that, the good side is you can turn up the gain in a low light situation. The downside is the higher ISO, the higher the gain, also amplifies the noise in the sensor. All solid state sensors, all electronic sensors have noise. If you turn up the gain, you're going to get more noise. So that's what you have to think about. So higher ISO allows capture of low light photographs at the expense of noise. And that's what this is saying down here. Less light, less noise, more light. Okay? That doesn't make sense to me. It does? Okay. Okay. But the truth is, you turn up the ISO, you're going to turn up the noise. And that may be okay for what your intent is. The other little bit of thing here to talk about is white balance, okay? And we talked just briefly about that when we were talking about the red, blue, green of the sensor itself. The white balance controls the spectral range and response of the sensor. Gray may be gray. It'll make gray in different types of colors of light. That's the white balance, particularly if you can select different modes, different types of light to get you to gray. So depending on if you go back to what the illuminating source is, if it's not of the temperature of the sun, it's going to have a color shift in it, okay? And that's what white balance will control. Photographic intent in the ISO, I think I just talked about this a bit. You know, high ISO captures low light subjects at the expense of higher noise. Also, it's less detail and less color differentiation or saturation. Because, why? Because you're amplifying less information. And if you have less information, okay, you just don't have as much detail and the sensor can't differentiate color and detail as well. So low ISO or lower gain provides less noise and much better tonality and detail. And that's to a greater or lesser extent depending on your camera, but those general trends are exactly what they are. Okay, let's go to shutter speed. Shutter speed, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's how long the light is allowed to impinge on the sensor. And the duration the shutter stays open lets the light, you can think of filling the sensor, filling that bucket. Okay, and here I want you to consider your intent. And it's primarily when you're thinking about shutter speed, you're thinking about, in terms of your intent, how do you want to portray motion in the subject you're shooting? And if we look at some of the favorite shutter speeds and why I use them, okay, typically a second or longer, I'm looking to smooth out motion. Okay, either there's water rippling on a river, lake, or pond, or something like that. It also allows a smaller aperture. Okay, if you think of the exposure triangle here, if I'm going to open up and leave light in longer, I've got to control the amount of light coming in either by reducing the ISO or reducing the size of the aperture. So a longer exposure allows a smaller aperture, which could give you a greater depth of field to a limit. And we'll talk about that in a bit. A quarter second or so allows intentional motion blur, usually useful like blurring the motion in streams or waterfalls or things like that. It's also useful for panning. If you're following a subject that's moving, that's what panning is. You're tracking that subject when you take the picture. And that quarter second allows the subject to be relatively sharp, but the background to blur out a bit and actually show motion. So if that's your intent, that's something to consider. A 30th of a second or so to a 60th of a second, it's about the minimum speed you can handhold some cameras or handhold a camera to allow a reasonably sharp picture. Some of the cameras these days have really excellent in-body stabilization. I know with the Olympus that I use, I can actually get down to a 10th or even a 5th of a second because the camera is doing the stabilization for me. But typically a 30th or a 60th of a second is about minimum to handhold reliably. Excuse me. About a 1/25th or 1/250th of a second is a good general subject setting. Then all things move a little, all things move a little, and this seems to work well to freeze and keep things sharp. So that's a good general setting. If you're getting up into high motion subjects where motion needs to be stopped, certain wildlife, sports for certain, you need to be up at least at a thousandth of a second. And if you're in pretty high motion and things like flying birds and things like that, if you can get up to 2,000 or 4,000, it's really what you need to do. But you need, as you can expect, as you begin to limit the amount of light coming in by going to these high shutter speeds, you're going to need a fair amount of light or a very high ISO to be able to meet your exposure. But that's what you want to think about. You want to think, oops, go back. You want to think about shutter speed and your intent, and how do you want to portray emotion?
Tom, on that last slide, could you just address again the handheld speed of a 30th of a 60th of a second as it relates to the millimeter size of your lens? Is that going to be true for a 300 millimeter versus your 60 millimeter lens?
Yeah, it's a good point. Typically, you think about the minimum speed you can handhold. There's another rule of thumb that says if you take a shutter speed of 1 over the focal length of the lens, that's kind of the limit of a handheld. Now, there's a lot of variables in that, and it's a kind of a pretty thin rule of thumb, but it gives you some idea. And the basic thought is that the longer the focal length, like a 200 or 300 millimeter or up in that range, you can think about it as a long, if you're trying to hold your arm out and keep the end of your finger steady, pointing at something, it's harder to do the longer the focal length. So you need to increase your shutter speed, meaning to go to higher than 1/60th, like 1/25th or 1/250th. But I have to caveat that a little bit with, again, some of the modern cameras have very good image stabilization. And even then, I know with my system, I can even handhold a 300 millimeter lens, which is pretty long, at about 100th or even an 80th of a second, because the camera does such work and the lens does such work to stabilize it. But you have to look at your own system and do some experimentation. That's the main thing. Some people are really good at being rock steady in how they hold their camera. Some people aren't. And you have to adjust your own shutter speed to accommodate for that. So experiment with it. This is a good question.
Thank you. Can you go back and mentally to your ISO? And you talked about as you go up in your ISO, you increase your noise, etc. How would you advise trying to figure out how high is too high? In other words, when does noise become a problem if you're not going to be using sophisticated software to try to get rid of noise?
Yep.
Does everyone stop at 400 or 3,200? Or how do you figure out that it actually matters from a practical point of view?
Another good question. Again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but do some experimentation. Get a good feel for your own camera and how much noise bothers you. I know a number of photographers, professional photographers that I follow have said that, they never did not sell a photo because it had noise in it. The intent of the photo was what carried the day. And if it was a little noisy, that was okay. I think it's more important to be able to capture the image with a little bit of noise than to try and get to such a slow shutter speed that you're going to blur things out and not have it. So the slower shutter speed allows in more light and allows you to go to a lower ISO, but it may also not meet your intent. If you're trying to shoot wildlife, if you're trying to do street scenes, if you're trying to do things that you want to freeze motion or not have a lot of motion, then you're going to have to raise your ISO, which is okay. You know, if you're really a pixel peeper and if you really noise bothers you, then you may have to get tripods. You may have to do things to allow you to go to lower ISO, which means you got to go slower shutter or wider aperture or both to keep the noise at a comfortable level for you. Again, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, except that you don't want to miss the shot. You don't want to miss your intent because you had too low an ISO because you were trying to squeeze noise out of it. I'm going to talk later about exposing to the right, and we'll talk a little bit more about noise and ISO and what that means. So I hope that if that doesn't answer your question, come back at me with it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I'll go ahead and proceed.
Sure. So we talked shutter speed, we talked ISO. The third leg of the triangle is aperture. So these funny f-stops, you're probably wondering how the heck did they come up with, you know, f2, 2.84, 5.6, what a strange numbering system. Well, first of all, remember what an f-stop is. So when they say it's f2, okay, right here in the second bullet, the f-stop is equal to the physical diameter of the opening in millimeters, typically, divided by the focal length of the lens in millimeters. So if I have an f2 50 millimeter lens, how big is the actual opening in there? Well, it's 25 millimeters because that's f2. So it's it's the opening of the lens divided by the focal length of the lens, which gives, well, actually, I've got f over 2. It's the relationship of these two. When you see an f-stop of 2, I've got this backwards, folks. It's the focal length divided by the diameter of the opening, okay? But that's the relationship. So you get so that keeps the same amount of light coming in for an f2, whether it's a 50 millimeter lens, a 1,000 millimeter lens, a 10 millimeter lens, okay? And you can tell f2, for instance, on 10 millimeters, how big is the opening, right? It's only 5 millimeters. How big is the opening on a 300 millimeter lens? It's 150 millimeters. That's why when you get to longer and longer focal lengths, you don't get to low f-stops because the size of the opening is going to be gargantuan. You can imagine carrying a 300 millimeter lens at f2. It's got 150 millimeters, which is what? It's a 5-inch opening. Okay, 6-inch opening. Excuse me. That makes for an awful big heavy lens. But that's the deal. And when you get out here, so if you remember our example of the water coming in as light. Okay, it's going to come in proportionate to what? The area of the diameter here, it's area of this circle, okay? So when I increase the radius or the diameter, if I increase it by twice, I'm going to what? I'm going to quadruple, I'm going to 4 times, I'm going to increase the light coming in by 4 times the square. That's why if you noticed, they go up by the power of the square root of 2, if you can tell this. So if you skip every second one, you'll see it goes up by 2 because square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is twice. So an f2 to an f4 to an f8 to an f16, that's the way I kind of remember these things, because I don't remember f11, 5, 6, and 2, 8 very well. But that's why these go up in strange increments. Okay, and the next one after f22 is f32 because 16 double is 32. So if you just remember the relationship, okay, it's the focal length of the lens divided by the actual diameter of the opening gives you the f-stop. That gives you an understanding of what's happening. But the same light, f-stop lets in the same amount of light regardless of the focal length of the lens. Now, how does the aperture impact the picture that you want to take or the photograph that you want to create? Lower f-stops, meaning f2, f1.4. If you have an f1 lens, that's why there's not many of these around. Just think about how big the lens has to be because it says F1 means the size of the opening of the aperture equals the focal length of the lens. So you get some pretty big lenses real quick. And that's very hard to actually make a lens physically to do that. Anyway, back to knowing your intent. Lower f-stops produce a shallow depth of field. They blur the background pretty radically. They have a very sharp cutoff front and back in terms of lower f-stops, in terms of how deep the field is that's in focus. That's what we mean by shallow depth of field. The distance between the front to the back of what's in focus is pretty small. Higher f-stops produce a deeper depth of field. Higher f-stops mean a smaller opening, sharper background. In one way, you can kind of think, and this is physically true to a degree, if you think of the size of the opening as the size of your paintbrush that you're trying to paint with, it gives you an idea of what it does to a background, for instance. Okay? Big fat brushes, low f-stops give you blurry background. Smaller f-stops, tinier brushes give you a sharper background. So that's a pretty simple way of looking at how the aperture controls the intent of your photograph. Most lenses are sharpest around f6 to f11. That's just the physics of designing a lens. The thing you have to be, you can think of, well, why don't I just go up to 16, 22, 32, somewhere up in there? I should get a really sharp, really deep depth of field, really sharp background. I did that about 10 years ago and I wasn't thinking, but the higher f-stoppers introduced something physically that's called diffraction, which softens the image. And I took a nice landscape down in the Caribbean at I think I was at a f32. I thought I'd be really, really sharp. It was worse. It was way worse than f11 or f16. What happens is when light bends around edges, and so when you get down to a very small opening, you can think of if you've looked in a still pond and you've seen water coming in and it hits the side of a deck or something that's there, you'll see the waves actually wrap around that to a little bit. They curve around the edge. It doesn't just go straight. And that's what happens with diffraction, and that softens the image. So most lenses stay sharp, really good and sharp, around 5.6 to 11. Again, doesn't mean you can't go wider or smaller. Depends on your intent, but just understand what happens. All right, now some of the fun part, right? Automated modes. Cameras, you really want to help you get the correct exposure and everything else and make it easy for you. Well, what's correct to them, to the engineer, may have absolutely nothing to do with what you want to do with your intent. So you need to understand how these modes work. You'll see a dial on your camera that has all these icons on it, M and AV and TV and P, and this is an Olympus. It's what I see. What do they mean? Well, M means manual, okay? You control the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO. It's all up to you. Auto means it's a point and shoot. The camera meters the scene and it selects the exposure for you. It does it all. So A or AV typically means aperture priority. And in this mode, you choose the aperture because you may want to have a very blurry background. You may want to have a shallow depth of field. You may want to have a very deep depth of field. That's the thing most important to you. You set the aperture. The camera then will meter the scene and automatically vary the shutter speed and the ISO and keep the aperture fixed. That's what aperture priority means. Excuse me. Thank you. If you see an S or a TV, it means shutter or time priority. And it automatically now varies the aperture in the ISO when it meters the scene and it keeps the shutter fixed. Well, I got a typo there. That should be shutter. Okay. So if you're looking at motion and you are trying to shoot something, like at times when I'm trying to shoot birds or things that are moving fast, the thing that's most important to me is the shutter speed. And I may go to shutter priority and do it that way. So that's what that mode is useful for, keeping the shutter at what you want to make it. P is called program mode, and it's kind of a semi-automated auto mode. Okay, the camera meters and makes an initial setting, and then you can vary either the speed or the aperture, and the camera will alter the other parts to make the exposure. So if you decrease the shutter speed by a stop, it will automatically increase the aperture. And if it's getting, at some point, I'm not exactly sure, it depends on the camera, it may change the ISO also. But program mode is kind of this step toward going all manual. But it helps you understand what's going on a little bit. There are also other automatic modes, like auto white balance. In that case, the camera tries to make any light neutral white shade or a neutral gray, whichever way you want to look at it. It can be good, it can be bad, depending on what your intent is. If you're shooting a sunset, don't have auto white balance on because you'll have a nice gray, shades of white picture. You'll lose every bit of color in that picture. Auto ISO varies the ISO to meet your good exposure. You may change the other things and it'll automatically change your ISO. And that's okay, except it may get you to a higher ISO than you want to get to. Just be aware of what it's doing. So again, what's most important is your intent and communicating your vision. It's far more important to know what your intent is than how you shoot or what mode you use. Whether you shoot a manual, auto, or anything in between, what's more important is, are you meeting your intent? If help from automation makes it easier to get the shot, it's far more important to get the shot. Use it. Okay, let's move on here. I included this one just for completeness. I'm not going to go through all these, but these are some of the icons that you'll see. If you look here on the top of this, in the upper right corner, the smaller image here, you see a bunch of different icons, and you typically see these more in a point and shoot type camera, maybe, or somewhere in between. They're kind of standardized to give you some idea, like in portrait mode. And I include this just for you to go through. You know, you keep your subject sharp while creating a beautifully blurred background. So what does that mean, folks, right? What do you think it's doing? Well, it's keeping the speed up, but it's opening up the aperture. And it may then vary the ISO, you know, to meet the correct exposure. Landscape mode, what's it typically doing? It's closing the aperture down. It's going to a higher aperture, okay? And it may lower the shutter speed too much for you. You have to be aware of that. Child mode, now they're looking at a moving subject. Sports mode, a very fast moving subject, so they're controlling the shutter speeds more. So close-up mode, they're closing down the aperture in order to get a bigger depth of field. So these are the types of things that you might find on the top of your camera, and I'll just include it here for you to go through. Okay, focus automation. It's something that I have, it's something that's more active in my shooting than sometimes I like it to be. Autofocus systems are very good in current cameras. You know, you can get to focus really quickly. And today's mirrorless cameras will outperform digital single lens reflex cameras. And the primary reason, and this isn't a huge, they don't outperform them in a huge way other than with highly moving subjects where you're trying to track something. You know, mirrorless cameras can actually have tracking in their focus where DSLRs can't do it because you can't because you have a mirror in the way. If you think about it, it's that mirror that clanks up and down in the single lens reflex camera, okay? And you can't focus directly on the focal plane. You actually have a separate focus system different from the focal plane, and that's what creates sometimes a little bit of performance shift. But mirrorless cameras are very good at focusing in many ways, but a basic understanding of how autofocus works will inform your creative process. And boy, we could do an hour to 2 hours just on the way focus works in cameras these days. So let me just leave it at, you need sufficient light. In other words, got to be bright enough. And you have to have some sort of contrast in your picture, some sort of edge somewhere in your image, somewhere in your composition or your subject, that the focus sensor, which are actually in mirrorless cameras, are built into the focus plane or into the focal plane, can work their magic on, basically. It has to be able to detect contrast, and if it can't see contrast, it can't focus. And it won't see contrast either because it's like misty, foggy, blurry, or you don't have an edge in the picture, or because the light's so low that it can't see the contrast. So you have to keep that in mind a little bit. The subject must have some edges and sufficient light to discern the edges, okay? Then we have these different focus modes. You'll see something, if I look over here in the chart on the right, something that says autofocus single or autofocus station, single shot AF-S. Typically, you'll see something like that, or one shot autofocus. Then you'll have a continuous autofocus, AFC for continuous, or autofocus servo in some other cameras. It's the same thing. And then you might have an automatic autofocus, which is kind of a blending of these two. Some cameras are getting enough power, processing power, where they'll assess what's happening in the image themselves. If it's nothing's moving, they'll stay in single. If something moves, they'll switch to continuous. You just need to understand what each of these means and when to use it. So the key thing is, what does the autofocus decide to focus on is driven by contrast. And so if you have a really busy, cluttered image, like you're trying to shoot through a tree, or the other day, actually a couple months ago, I was shooting in a pretty heavy snowstorm, and a fox I could see in the distance, and I tried to focus on it. I had great difficulty doing it because it kept focusing on the snow that was falling, because that had a much better contrast than the fox did in the distance. I had to quickly remember how to switch to manual focus and try and focus that way. So just remember, it's driven by contrast. And now the focus modes themselves, the single point or the auto area or area auto, that's the area mode is when you might see little green rectangles light up in your image viewer, the electronic viewer, or whatever you have, that shows what the focus system is focusing on, where it's focusing in your image. The only thing to remember is that it's really picking, the actual focus sensor itself is smaller than a pixel. Okay, so it's not as big as the rectangle that it shows on your image plane. And for a busy scene, carefully use single point focus, because it can be jumping around and focusing on other things. And if it's a really busy scene, you probably want to switch over to manual focus. I'm not sure I covered that real well. If there are questions, let me know.
I think that was good, Tom. No questions.
Well, this one gives some questions maybe. So some tips. In the area modes, make sure you match the selectable, today's cameras, you can actually select the number of focus sensors you want to use and match that up with your intent. If you're shooting on a subject that's moving relatively fast or has motion in your scene and it's only a small percentage of your scene, you may want to reduce the number of focus sensors that you're using. If you have a broad panoramic scene, you might want to open up and use a higher number of focus sensors. Just be careful you notice where it's focusing. In most cameras, you have what's called center focus and recompose. That's where you take the shutter button and you bring it down halfway or so, and in autofocus single shot mode, it'll focus at that point somewhere in your image. And if you focus that point in the center of your image, then they say, well, then you can move and recompose your image as long as you hold the shutter halfway down and you've held that focus, and then you can take the shot by pressing the the shutter all the way down. So that's what I'm calling center focus and recompose. And that works. I've used it a lot myself, but I've since moved away from it, and I'll tell you a little bit why. But it's okay. Keep this in mind, again, with intent and how this works. Center focus and recompose is good if you have a fairly wide depth of field. Okay, so if you've got f8 or thereabouts, and you want to center focus and recompose and take your image, that's fine. It's much better to get the image than to be trying to play around with something that isn't working for you. And it certainly works only if your subject is stationary and hasn't moved by the time you've recomposed. So you have to keep that in mind. But if you have a shallower depth of field, either a longer lens, or a smaller f-stop, if you move the focus point and the depth of field is shallow, you actually are moving out of focus slightly. And the reason is over here in this little diagram I tried to make. If your point of focus is here, the focal plane is going to be flat, okay? And with that basically, but the physics of the lens is if you move, there's actually an arc in the focus. A small arc, but it's a little bit. So if you move off center, you're going to have a little bit of difference. And if you're really critical in your focusing, that's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is use is to move the focal point in your image, in your field of view. You can move the focal point from the center, move it off to the side where you want, and refocus at that point using that focus point sensor. So I just wanted to make that just a little point. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is back button focus. And that literally is moving control of the autofocus when it's in operation to a separate button off the shutter button. I highly recommend it. Most camera manuals will tell you how to do it, or you can actually, for your camera model, probably Google it or look it up on YouTube. It'll tell you how to do it. But in that case, you have the shutter button is for controlling the shutter, period. And then the back button focus is for controlling autofocus. It turns it on or turns it off, depending on how you press it. What that does is it reduces focus hunting. With any system, it's going to look to find the focus, and it can't understand, it's a mechanical system, or it's an electromechanical system. It doesn't really know where it is. It tries to go a little bit in front, a little bit in back, and it begins to focus in and find the best focus by looking at some characteristics that it picks up on the sensor. But in order to do that, it's got to move a little bit in and out. In focus, out of focus, in focus, out of focus. That's called focus hunting. And I have noticed it in some of my shooting when I shoot like about 8 or 10 frames a second, like at air shows or things like that. I'll look at a string of pictures where I know I had the moving subject in focus. But if I look critically in my post-processing, I'll see about every second picture is sharp, every other picture is sharp, and every other in between those two, there's a slightly out of focus picture, and I couldn't understand why. And the reason is because it's moving in and out very fast, and if you've got a situation where there's not a lot of motion, you'll never know it. But back button focusing allows you to control the focus. So if you want to focus on something in a landscape scene, you can focus it and then take your finger off the button. And now anything you shoot in that scene, you can reposition, you can reshoot. As long as nothing has moved in your situation, it'll be in focus. And it gets rid of any hunting of your system. So it's just something to consider. Look it up if you're curious about it. Do a little research on the internet. You'll find a lot of professional photographers use that, particularly outdoor photographers.
Tom?
Yes.
One of the comments was, I changed to back button focusing years ago and never went back. And I agree, it's really a strong way to set up your
once you get to the comfort level that you want to try it, I think you'll find that you can control your camera more to meet your intent, and it actually makes things easier for you, and you'll have higher confidence that you're getting the pictures that you want. Okay.
If I can go back to your little diagram here and just make a comment, I don't know if it will come up later or not, and that is not the technique, but the concept of focus stacking. The diagram fully explained to me what I had a little trouble with. Focus stack, when you focus, you want a large area in focus, and you focus on the front of the rows and the middle and the back, and you then put 3 or 20 images together. As you go through those images, there is a slight focus change happening as you focus. Even though the camera hasn't moved, the cropping will change. And that has to do with your curved line. And that now explained to me the concept very well of why there's a focus shift when you're doing focus stacking, taking multiple focus points, but not moving the camera. It's because of the curvature. You're moving the curve basically where your point of focus arrow is. So that was excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, what's called is off-axis performance in your lens. For people designing lenses, the wider and wider the lens, the circle, the diameter of the lens is, the tougher and tougher it is to get off-axis performance in the lens. It's just the physics of the situation. So when you get off center, things can get a little wonky when you're really doing some of the things that Vince is trying to do and focus stacking and some things like that. But I just wanted you to consider some of these things. They're tips. And then situations to consider in terms of focus. If you're doing a long exposure, particularly if you've got a neutral density filter on or something like that, you probably want to go to manual focus and do your focus on a tripod, then put your filters on and so on. If you're fog and mist, what did we just learn, right? I mean, your autofocus is not going to work very well, or certainly isn't going to work reliably. So learn how to focus manually. You'll want to make sure you get the shot that way. Low light, you may be challenged that way too, unless you have something bright in the area of your subject that you want to be in focus. But if there's nothing bright there, you may have to manually go again. Astrophotography is a whole different thing, but you have to, I shot the moon, I don't know, a few months ago when the two planets are close to each other. You have to carefully go to manual focus to make sure, I think, to make sure things were as good as your lens can get. In portrait mode, you want to focus on the eye, okay? The camera, well, some of today's modern cameras have eye focus options in them. Well, it'll shift to your focus system to look for eyes, and the processors, believe it or not, in cameras today can find that eye and it can focus there. So these are just some situations to consider. If you've got a cluttered situation, you're trying to catch a bird in a bunch of tree branches, or a moving child in a busy playground or something like that, you may have to be very careful on how you're focusing. Okay. Let's get into another aspect of what your camera does, and that's metering. And this is another area you should pay attention to and understand, because it can be very effective in the way you create your photographs. So all cameras pretty much these days, unless you intentionally get a camera without a meter in it and have an external meter, have light meters inside. They measure the light from the scene and assess that in terms of exposure numbers, okay, and gives an indication of plus or minus over what is what. And that's the question. What is just right for that bucket that's getting filled up? So you'll see something up here, like at the top is one type. You'll see another one here in the middle. You'll see something that looks like this, where you'll see a -1, 2, or 3, or a +1, 2, or 3, or just a 0 with a plus and some indicators on either, or a minus on the other side. Canon has a little different. What it's telling you is it's showing you the amount of light coming in to how you have your camera set in terms of the ISO, aperture, and f-speed, in terms of whether the bucket is going to be, and this is the question, what? Full, empty, in the middle? What do you think? Well, the metering assumes everything is a middle gray. It's the old 18% gray. So when you see a perfect exposure in your camera meter, it's telling you it's perfect for a middle gray scene. And you have to keep that in mind, okay? And we'll talk more about that in a moment. There are also several metering modes you'll typically see. If you look here in the lower right chart, there's something like spot metering, something that's a partial, and there's different names for this, but it does. Spot metering literally uses one spot. If these dots are the exposure sensors in the camera. Partial metering uses a little more. Center weighted metering gives more importance to the middle light in the frame versus the light not in the middle of the frame. And then there's various other kind of proprietary systems for evaluative matrix or pattern metering. You can look in your manuals to give you a better idea. You just have to understand which is best for you in terms of, again, what the subject is you're looking for and how it works best for your intent. So the average across the field, a center weighted, a spot, or a matrix meter, which means it evaluates things a little differently. Go do a little research, understand the strengths and weakness of each, again, to match your intent. But you want to understand what you're looking at here a little bit, because the better you understand it, the quicker you'll meet your intent. So keep in mind, and this is really important, that your meter assumes everything is middle gray. So if you had this picture here, this is the middle picture right here is what it thinks is a perfect exposure because it's middle gray. The majority of the image is white, and it's going to place that right in the zero, right at a perfect exposure, not too much, not too little. And there's something in your camera that you can use called exposure compensation. Usually it's one of the thumb dials where you can quickly adjust the exposure in your scene by up or down a few f-stops. Okay, either f-stops or shutter speeds, depending on how you have it set up and which dial you use. But you can quickly adjust the exposure without twiddling around the top. You can keep your eye on your subject. And in this case, this is probably the best exposure, +2, which means you wanted to move the middle gray because you knew it was white, move it up 2 or 3 f-stops. In this case, it was 2. All right. If you had a white scene, like snow, and we'll talk about this in a minute, it's going to meter that snow for being a middle gray. Okay. And so again, you would want to move it up. All right. If you had an overall dark image, okay, it's going to try and overexpose it to get it up to middle gray. You may want to decrease the exposure to get it back to where it was, where your intent was. So look up exposure compensation, understand how the power of it. It's pretty useful once you understand how to use it. Then come to one of my favorites, the histogram. Excuse me. It's probably one of the most powerful tools you have in digital photography. Okay, and it's what you can use to get the correct exposure for your intent almost every time. Don't trust what you see on the back of your camera. Okay, you don't trust that it looks great there or doesn't look great. That gives you just a general idea. Look at your histogram and understand how to use it. So, excuse me a second. You need to understand what a histogram is. It's basically a graph of the exposed pixels for the image you are about to take across the luminosity values. So one axis, the x-axis, goes from black to white and dark and medium and light tones in between. And then the y-axis is typically the number of pixels that fall on each one of those luminosity values. So if you had a perfectly middle gray image, well, we'll look at some here in a minute. It would all fall in the middle here, and you'd see a big peak there. If you had a very bright image, you'd see it over here, a very dark image over here. But it shows the tonal distribution from black to white. There's no perfect shape for a histogram. It's driven by your scene. What it does do is tell you the amount of information that you're going to capture. Okay? Cameras capture light and turn it into data. That is textures, details, tonality. That data information is what you want to maximize in order to get a better photo. So I'm just making a general statement here, but you want to capture as much information without getting loss of information, which occurs when you go up against the high side. Okay, and that's called clipping, when pixels are full black. If things are too black, you got nothing. And if they're too white, you're losing information because it can't get any better, it can't get any further than white. Okay, you push stuff all up against it, and it's all the same then. So you want to make sure you look in critical areas of your composition for what's called loss of information or clipping. Okay, but you'll use your histogram to do that. And typically the histogram covers, if you look at it, about 3 stops to the left and 3 stops to the right. And that gives you a fairly quick understanding of how you might want to adjust your exposure. So let's look at some typical histograms, okay? Recall that you're going to lose information. You want to capture as much information as you can. You're going to lose information when pixels are full black or full white in critical areas. So if you have a histogram that looks like this one, go away. Oops, go back. If it looks like this one, everything's crammed up against the dark side, the black side, you're way underexposed and you're not gathering enough information. Here it's exposed to the left, depending on your scene. That may be acceptable. I'm going to talk in a minute where I think that's, while it's acceptable, you're not capturing as much information as you could if you moved it to the right. This is a neutral exposure. You don't have anything running up against black, and you don't have anything running up against full white. So that's good. This is an exposed to the right, which I'll talk about in a second, which really captures the most information you can get without losing information. And this is overexposed, or where you're driving stuff, the buckets are overflowing. You're losing information by overflowing the buckets. You're overexposed. So most cameras have something where you can see in your back on your histogram or on your image in the back what are called blinkies, which will flash where in areas of your image that are overexposed, where you've lost information. Again, look in your manuals to figure out how to turn that on. It can be very useful for a quick look. I tend still just to look at the histogram, but what works for you is what's best. Okay. So I do a lot of exposed to the right. And this is what it is and what is it? All right. So ETTR, exposed to the right. It's an approach to maximize the amount of collected light data. I have to say it's something that you should do if you do post-processing, okay? Because you'll want to move it back. But it's the way to capture the most data in your image and reduce noise and increase tonality. So as far as looking at a histogram, okay, expose as far to the right as you possibly can without pushing up against the right side of that histogram. So let's talk a little bit about, go to the next one. This is an intermediate step in your raw workflow, okay? The image will not look right on your camera preview, but you need to trust the histogram, and I'll talk a little more about that. You'll adjust the exposure back down in post-processing. Any raw processor, whether it's on one, Lightroom, Photoshop, or just Adobe's raw processor, all that matters is the histogram in digital photography, really. So if we look at the physics behind it, any sensor, if you look at a histogram, and this is highly exaggerated, okay, but this is the amount of pixels you have, and you're going to have noise down in the black area or the low tones of your image. Now this is highly exaggerated, but it's there. If you have a low ISO, you're going to have the blue area. You're going to have a little amount of noise. If you have a higher ISO, it's going to come up and be bigger. When you take an image, that noise is still there, depending on what your ISO is set to. So if you have a scene, typical scene that's finally, it's normally exposed, you got a lot of gray and not too much white, and that's a fine scene. But if you expose to the right, you'll want to open it up, push more light into your sensor, and as long as you're not clipping, which shows you're not, you're going to gather more information, okay? That's probably a stop more light from here to here than you had. And then when you move it back in your raw processing, you've frozen the noise and taken your picture. What happens? That noise gets compressed. And it actually, you reduce the amount of noise in your picture by exposing to the right. So that's a real quick, simple explanation, but it shows you why it works. So if I give you an example, here's an image I took this winter of a little Carolina wren, and I exposed to the right. And to me, this is kind of, you'd say, well, it's washed out, it's a little overexposed and so on, except I wasn't hard up against the right side, as you can see here. And this is the post-processed histogram. I moved the exposure back down and I turned the black level down a bit and so on, pulled this back to the left. And this is the image that I ended up with. So it gives you better tonality. It reduces the amount of noise. So I try and expose to the right the best I can. It's not good for all situations, but it's certainly something I highly advise you consider whenever you can.
Tom, that last diagram before this one was the best I've seen on that particular topic.
Yeah.
As a summary, could you just say, exposing to the right, are you purposefully overexposing, or are you just giving a little bit more light so the histogram slides but doesn't get all the way to the edge?
Yeah, and I think you're right in both of what you just said. You are overexposing in terms of what is your light meter would say, or what what you would want to end up with, what you typically would think. But as long as you can pack more light into your sensor, the sensor is going to perform better. So you want to actually overexpose a little bit from what normal would be, as long as you don't run up against, saturating at the white side. okay? And then in your post process, because what that does is it locks in the noise, okay? Once you snap the shutter, you got whatever noise you've got in the scene that you took. Now, if you can slide it back down, decrease the exposure, okay, move your histogram back to the left into what's a well-developed image, you're going to compress your noise and remove it. Not all of it, but it'll be better than it was.
So what if you kept your camera on the compensation dial +1?
It will certainly push it to the right, which you'd want to make sure, we'll talk a little more about shooting in manual. You would just want to make sure that you're not running into any, scene that might push yourself off to the right.
So what you're saying is if you are going to do that, you need to keep watching that histogram.
Yeah, you want to assess it. And we'll talk a little about, I shoot a lot in manual mode. As long as your light is not changing, if we think about that little system flow diagram I had early on, as long as the illuminating light is not changing, it doesn't matter whether you're shooting into the light, away from the light, and so on. If you're out in the same situation and the light doesn't change, your exposure isn't going to change. So if you moved a little bit to the right for that, it's probably good for most of your settings. If you moved into the shade, physically moved everything into the shade, if a cloud came in front of the sun, if you went from a dark street scene to a bright street scene, you're going to have to look at it differently. But as long as the light doesn't change, your settings aren't going to change.
So why do you have the noise on the black left side of the histogram and not on the white overexposed side of the histogram?
Because noise, well, you need to know the physics a little bit of the electronics, but you only have noise at the where there's lack of information. That's where you can see the noise, okay? Because it's very little, okay? But if you're dealing with little information and it's on the same, like black, okay, black is no information, okay? If you have a little information down here, again, this is exaggerated, but you have a little information down here and it's on the same order of noise, you're going to see the noise. That's why if you shoot into a sky, you have a deep blue sky, you're going to see noise in that blue. That's because it's way down here. The deep blue is way down at this side of the histogram and it's competing with noise, okay? And you just don't get noise where you have a lot of information. It's all down in the lower levels. If you have more information up here, you'll never see the noise.
But if you flip on the right side, you don't have any information on the right side then.
Right, but that's just, this top one would be basically a black picture, okay? This one, I'll tell you what, Vince, wait till we get to a couple examples and I'll show you.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep, just trying to reflect.
Yeah, no, I got you. Let's see if I answer your question. If not, we'll come back to it. So let's talk a little more about your intent and what the right mode is and what are all these modes. And gosh, I go out to shoot and I got to think about everything that I'm going to be doing. This is kind of works for me, and I've learned this from Jared Lloyd, who's a really great outdoor photographer, and from others. This is what really works for me. Assess your shooting situation intent before you're there, of course. That's what's best. Or you're going into a situation you've been in before, you know what you're looking for. But the first thing I'll do is I'll assess what is my desired depth of field, and that's what I'll set my aperture to. So if I need a really deep depth of field, I'm going to go smaller. If I don't care, then I can go almost anywhere in between. If I want shallow, I'm going to go farther open. So once I've set the aperture, then I'm going to consider, is there motion in my subject? And if there's motion in my subject, how do I want to capture it? And based upon how I want to capture it, whether I want to freeze it or blur it or anything in between, I'll choose my shutter speed. And then what's left, right? In the exposure triangle, I've set my aperture, I've set my shutter. The only other thing I can now vary to meet what's a good exposure is to adjust my ISO. And that's typically the way I do it. Now, typically, I won't have any real hard feelings about what's here, except maybe if I've got a high motion wildlife of some sort I'm trying to capture, then my aperture is most important. Excuse me, my shutter is most important. And I don't want my aperture too wide, particularly if I've got a long lens on the camera, because then the depth of field is so shallow, so I might want to step down. That's what drives my ISO. But what's most important to me will probably be my shutter. If I'm into landscape photography, I don't care so much about the shutter. I want bigger depth of field, and then I'll work the ISO to be as low as possible because that's where I get better tones and better saturation in my images. Set your focus mode depending on the subject motion and available light. Remember, if it's motion, you probably want to go to a smaller focus, a target in your focus. Set your focus mode to be either single, what am I trying to say? Single shot focus mode, a freezed single frame focus, or a continuous focus. And then you want to set the number of focus sensors you may be using. And then start taking photographs, okay? But the main thing here is if you think about it going into the field or go into whatever your situation is, if you kind of run through this checklist a little bit at the beginning, then you only have one thing to worry about in terms of your exposure. That's the ISO and how it works on how it drives your histogram, okay? So it's just that's a thought process I typically have used. I shoot probably manual 90% of the time, and like I was just mentioning to Vince, if the incident light doesn't change, then the settings are going to remain regardless of how the subject moves around or where it goes. So as long as it's still the clear blue sky or the slightly overcast day or things like that, you don't need to worry of shooting in manual because it's not going to change that much. Check your histogram every now and then and see how it works. This allows you to concentrate on what's most important, and that's creating a compelling photograph that has impact. So you can think about being creative and not so much about what are all those bells and whistles on your camera. Let's go into some examples, okay? A winter scene, okay? So winter photography in general. Exposure is critical to capture the essence of, well, we just had the essence of winter as our subject. But remember, if you just look at your exposure meter and you look at the dial on your exposure meter and you look at this scene here on the right and you want to put that right on 0, the whole thing is going to come out gray, okay? Remember, the exposure meter is going to try and make the snow middle gray, so you need to compensate by 2 or 3 stops. What? More light, open it up, slower shutter speed, whichever, but get you to most of your histogram is up here in the high end without saturating, because then you lose the texture in your snow. So that's what you're looking at. In this image, I was at a 400th f16 and ISO 400. Okay. So the average. So thinking about this, so if I used an average meter reading for this scene, it probably would have had me at 2 or 3 stops higher than shorter than a 400th, maybe 800th or a 16th of a 100th, because it was a very bright day. Okay, so I'd either want to, again, decrease my ISO, okay, which would lighten this up. Okay, so watch your highlights on your histogram in snow and don't saturate. If we take a look at moving subjects.
Excuse me, Tom, could you explain what that means, don't saturate?
Yeah, well, if you go back to our analogy in the water flowing into the bucket, saturate means you're gathering light and you're filling up the bucket with information. And if you saturate, you're overfilling the bucket, which means now everything is going to be what? White or overexposed.
And the ISO is
right.
Actually shows a line on that side.
Yes, if you look at if we go back here, it would look like this one down here. If you look at your histogram, you'd be saturated, meaning you would have things hard up against the right side of your histogram, which means there's a whole bunch of things that are absolutely full bucket white, okay, which means you're losing information. This one is good. This is probably a snow scene or something you've exposed to the right. You have a lot of information up in the higher tones, but you're not having anything full against the right side. Okay, so you're not losing information. So if we go back here,
blown out.
Blown out, yep. You hear the term blown out, which just means blown out white. It means it's just flat white. There's no tonality, there's no texture because you've lost the information. You've overfilled the bucket, you can't tell anymore. So we go to moving subjects. The thing you want to think about in a moving subject is what's your intent. Do you want to show motion or do you want to freeze motion? When I was shooting this at the racetrack, I kind of wanted to try and do both a little bit, but I wanted to freeze the subjects, which were the riders, while blurring the background, and you do that by panning, okay? And that can be a little tricky, and it's a skill you want to practice and learn how to do. But here I wanted to get a slow enough shutter speed, and actually they were going fairly fast, so 2/50th allowed the wheels to blur and allowed the background to blur, yet I could, by panning at a 2/50th, I could freeze their faces and so on, which weren't moving very fast at all compared to their bikes. So, and this was continuous focus. So I could pan and watch them, and it was focusing all the time that I was panning against them. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So I used a fairly deep depth of field, f8, a shutter speed that would freeze them and allow some blur in the background, and that forced the ISO there to go to 1600 because it wasn't a real bright area. It's fairly bright, but not like daytime. Okay. How about moving subject again? Do you want to slow the motion or freeze the motion? Well, this one, my intent was to contrast the rocky texture with smoothed out flow of water. That's what I was kind of experimenting with. So I ended up at a higher f-stop than I really wanted to, but I wanted a long exposure. In this case, it was, a little over 3 minutes. And in a low ISO because I wanted to, again, slow thing. I was trying to force the shutter speed up to a long shutter speed. So I do what? So I have to lower the ISO, reduce the gain as much as I could. And I used like a 10-stop neutral density filter in order to get this. And that forced me then to focus in manual mode because you can't have this, you can't look through the camera with a 10-stop, with a high density filter on there. But this is what I ended up with. Now, I'm going to talk near the end here of some tips, and one little rule of thumb that's very useful to me is what's called Sunny 16. And what the Sunny 16 rule says basically is that in full open sunlight, no clouds, clear day, no haze, full sun, you're darn close to the correct exposure by going to f16, and whatever your ISO is, 1 over that is your shutter speed. So in this case, f16, so if this is a pretty bright day. Well, actually it wasn't a bright day. That's what I need to talk about. It was an overcast day, but as a starting point, particularly when I'm going to a long exposure, if the correct exposure here was f16 on a bright day, then I'm going to adjust for the clouds and I'm going to take it down, in this case, about 3 stops, okay? Because you'll learn that, a slightly cloudy is about a stop, a fairly overcast is 2 stops, and kind of dingy is 3 stops, and this was kind of a dingy morning. It was actually raining a little bit. So that means what? To open up, because I don't have as much light, so I need to slow the shutter speed down. So I went to a 50th, and then to a 25th, and then to a 10th. And I know those aren't exactly powers of 2, but that's kind of the way the cameras were set up. But I went down 3 stops, so I ended up at a 10th. Then I have my 10-stop neutral density filter. And what am I doing with each stop, right? It's a power of 2. So I'm just trying to ballpark in my exposure to get the right one. So 10 stops. So if this was the exposure without the negative 10 stops, then I went to a 25th and then to a half and then to a second. So I'm going increasing the exposure by 2, roughly 2 each time. So from a 10th to 1/25th to 1/50th to 1, and then 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 126. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stops. So I said, well, okay, f16, 128 seconds, ISO 100. I wanted even longer, so I increased by a stop, okay, from 16 to 22, which means I need to double the speed, right? Cut the light down in half, increase the light by 2, so I'm back to where I was, and that's what I thought would be my starting point. I ended up close to that, okay? That's what I ended up at. So I know that's a lot of talk, but it gives you an idea how to move things through and what some of these little tricks of the trade can be to help you get there. Because the problem is, if you're not close to the right exposure when you're waiting for 3 minutes to get one exposure, then you got to adjust and wait another 3 minutes to get the next one and the next one. It becomes a little laborious after a while. So this one gets you close. It's also, when you just go out in the field and get started, it's a good starting point to remember the Sunny 16 rule. It'll get you close. Okay, moving subjects again. What's your intent? I wanted to freeze motion of small birds landing with a soft background. So I ended up pushing me up. I started at 5.6 because that gave me a fairly shallow depth of field, yet enough depth on the bird. I went up to a 3200th of a second, which forced me to ISO 3200. I used a fixed focus at a pre-selected point. I actually put the camera on a tripod with a RF shutter release that I could do from a distance, radio frequency release, and focused at a stick that I set up right here, and then took it all away and waited behind our window in our kitchen and took some shots. And the shutter was at 10 frames per second, so I could try and catch it somewhere as he was coming into land. And that's what I ended up with. So again, knowing your intent, okay, and you want to freeze the motion, so high shutter speed, soft background. This is a relatively long lens, so a 5.6 was really giving. This is probably 30 feet behind the bird, so it's nice and blurred out. And you had to push the ISO up. In this case, there's a fair amount of noise here in the background, but you know, it didn't bother me too much, okay? So that's where you make your decisions.
Tom, can you go back to the bicyclists?
Yep.
So the question was if you wanted that background to be less in focus, what would you change in your camera settings? I mentioned there were two ways to do that. One would be to lower the depth of field, make it more shallow by having a smaller f-stop, f4, or lower shutter speed, a bigger f-stop, or a slower shutter speed to blur it more, making your panning a little bit more difficult. So could you expound that? Are you happy with that?
No, that's exactly what we just talked about a little bit. So I'm at f8 here because I was worried a little bit. I had not a real long lens, but I had an intermediate lens. I think it was 150 or 200, somewhere in there, millimeters. And I didn't want the background guys to be out of, really blurred. So I thought I would go to f8. But if it bothered you that there was still too much focus back here, and your intent was, well, I don't care, I'm just interested in this guy, okay? Then yeah, I dropped this to a 5.6 or a 4, which means what? I'm letting in more light. So then I've either got to increase my shutter speed or decrease the ISO to get back to the same exposure, right? So if I went down 2 f-stops here, if I went to f4, I would probably choose to lower the ISO, okay? Because it's pretty high here. So I'd go one f-stop down, which would be 800, another f-stop down would be ISO 400. So I'd go f4, ISO 400, and a 250th would get me to roughly the same thing, okay? Except my depth of field would be shallower, right? If I wanted to keep that and still blur out the background, then I would slow down my shutter speed, okay? Maybe to a 25th or even a 60th. Then your panning skills are really going to be tested in order to keep these guys relatively sharp. And you would then again want to lower your ISO because you're letting in more light by increasing your shutter speed. Excuse me, by decreasing the shutter speed, which is letting in more light.
And you're the king in our club of skill with panning. Do you pick your the lead guy and just keep him in the same spot in the viewfinder to make sure you're at the right speed?
Yeah, it's kind of a intuitive thing. Once they going by you, you try and just keep the whole thing centered a little bit and keep it on continuous focus. You know, one of the things I've done, just as an aside, I've gone out to a road next to a highway, so I'm away like 100 or 125 feet, and just practice panning and taking cars going down the highway and trying to fix them, okay, with different speeds and different situations. You begin to learn how your camera and you work together in order to get a situation like this that works, okay? Because what happens is you want a slow enough shutter speed that you can see motion in the wheels, but not so slow that it's, you know, you're only getting 1 out of 50 shots, that it's acceptable. So it's something you need to work with. It's a skill you develop. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, when to use what? What about fog or mist? And this was an interesting one. I took this about 10 years ago, actually. And it was fog or mist, and I was not as skilled as I am today. But you got to watch your histogram, and you may have to manually focus because why? Because there isn't a lot of detail here for the focus sensors to hone in on. So you may have to use your own eye. My intent here was low noise the best I could because I wanted a watercolor-like photograph. So this was actually taken as shot, okay? It looked like this, and the histogram looked like this. And here's a perfect example of why you would want to expose to the right, okay? Because there was more noise in here than I wanted. And what did the exposure do? It did a very good job of making it middle gray, okay? Which really isn't what I wanted, okay? But I shot it at f9, 1250, 1/1250th, and at 400. I should have been exposing to the right using more like f8 and a 400th instead of that fast a speed. So slowing the shutter speed down would what? Increase the amount of photons coming into the light bucket and keeping the ISO where it was. Because this is, I post-processed it, this is what the histogram looked like when I was done. There's still some information down here. These are the trees and maybe some dark areas in here, but most of the image you want up here in the near white tones, in the high key area, okay? So it's just it's what I learned to be careful and why I exposed to the right today, because my noise would have been a lot less. There is some noise in the trees here from this photo because I had to drag things up to the right. What happens when I expose things out to the right? The noise that's down here gets pulled to the right, which means you begin to see it easier. So that's why you want to expose to the right. I'm sure everybody's eyes are rolling up at this point.
The comments say they're loving your presentation.
Okay.
I think he's
Thanks,
lying
Vince.
to you. I think he's a
They're all
fanatic.
coming from Meg. No, only kidding.
All right, here's a dark scene again. What to use with what? This was certainly low light. It was sunset. We were out on one of our cruise adventures. But you really want to. Here's where you want to watch the histogram, and you want to be able to see the different colors. If you can set your histogram to show you a color histogram, that's where you want to go. Or sometimes you can set it to see the red, blue, green individual histograms, particularly where you're shooting a scene that has a particular color that is really important to you. Be careful you don't oversaturate it. Because if I just looked at this histogram, I'd say, well, I need to move it more to the right. But then I have to look more carefully when I look at the rosy tones in this image. They're way over here, almost overexposed as it is. Okay? So particular when you're in a multi-stop situation, like, you know, you have some highlights or some key areas that are very different than the others in the image, look at your histogram very carefully. So my intent was a dark mood with highlights of sunset on the water that I didn't want to just overexpose. I wanted to see texture, for instance, here in the ripples with the seagull on the water. I wanted to see that texture. So I ended up at a 2.8, so pretty wide open because it was pretty dark, a 30th, and a 200. And I had a bias, this is the exposure compensation, of minus 1.7 stops because it's going to try and make this whole scene, what? Middle gray. It's going to push it over here. All right. So this is manually what I set up, but it really was a bias of almost excuse me, -2 stops. But so the two inches here, you know, be very careful on your histogram when you're shooting situations like this. And also, and I didn't put this on here, I just thought about it. My white balance, I leave my white balance set on the sunny day. I don't do much indoor shooting, but even when I do, it comes out just fine pretty much. But I leave it on sun because I don't leave it on auto, because auto would have tried to make this whole image a middle gray. And you lose colors when you do that, particularly when you're shooting a sunset. So if you're shooting outdoors, I pretty much leave it on the sun because it's what you see. Dark is the blue hour. You see things in blue. You get the highlights in the correct color, what your eyes really see, and that's what you see here. Yeah, one more picture. So this is one I took recently. And it's just, it was really challenging catch. It was low light, so watch your histogram so the highlights are not saturated. You may have to manually focus, but my intent was to catch the snow geese in front of the rising moon. And I had a probably equivalent about a 450 lens on here, 450 millimeter lens. And it was a challenge to track and focus on the snow geese and not the moon. And what I found I had to do was, first of all, see when the geese were coming because they were a long ways off. Focus on them as they were coming up this way, and make sure the focus stayed on them when I got in front of the moon, and take shots as it went by. It was about 8 frames a second. Because if I waited till the moon was anywhere in the frame, it'd snap in and focus on the moon because it really liked that contrast back there. And the birds actually were then slightly out of focus. So it's challenging to track and focus on the geese and not the moon. I was at a 5.6 because I actually didn't care too much about the depth of field at that distance. 2000s to make sure I captured it. 400 gave me a good exposure. And I was in continuous focus plus tracking on my camera, which allowed me to actually be able to do this. And today's cameras, particularly the mirrorless cameras, have very powerful processors in there, but they also have a lot of things you can make them do. And when you're in a really challenging situation, like, you know, getting the camera to continuously focus and track takes up a lot of processing power. So one of the things you can do is make sure you offload the in-camera processor to make sure the CPU, the central processing unit, doesn't get overloaded trying to do the tracking. So how do you do that? Well, you go manual with as much as you can. So don't have it metering anything. Don't have it trying to do anything other than just, in this case, maintain continuous focus and track. So it's just a thought, because you can overload the processors, and then you'll get less acceptable number of images because it gets overloaded. I talked about that. So that was a fun day. That was up at Middle Creek, and it was a beautiful I guess it was an evening, wasn't it? Late afternoon. The moon was just rising. The sun hadn't set, and it was neat. So, and you just notice in one of Vince's articles on shooting the moon, right? This is not quite a full moon. You can see that it's just before being full moon, because you actually want it rising before the sun sets or it gets too dark. So it was up over the horizon and up, I don't know, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. And the sun was still just above the horizon, nice warm light, and you could be able to get shots like these. Okay, getting near the end, some useful tips. So I talked about sunny 16, bright sunny day, so the exposure is f16, the shutter speed is 1 over your ISO value, and then whatever your ISO value is, you pick it. That's a good starting point. So it's useful to start and then adjust with your histogram. Exposure compensation, learn how to do that on your camera. It's a real easy way to adjust for exposure fairly quickly by just using your thumb dial, and you can go up or down a number of stops. And it's very, very useful in varying light situations. Back button focus, once you get used to it, and I tell you, I didn't start that way. I started with all the other focus things, but once you get used to it, you'll find it's very useful for you. But it can be confusing starting out if you're worried about other things going on too, in terms of what your exposure is and everything else. So something to look into, learn a little bit about it. Expose to the right. I think whenever you can do that, if you're doing post-processing, is this thing you should be doing. Keep the histogram to the right of the center without saturating the highlights, and then correcting the post, and you'll get lowered noise and better tonality and more detail. What's the best lens? It's the one you got on, okay? And I mean that. So if you're gonna get into a situation that you've been waiting for, or you're going into, or it's a fleeting moment, take the picture first, then consider what lens you want to use. Make sure you take that picture first and capture it. And then lastly, same light, same exposure when you're shooting in manual, simplify. As long as the light hasn't changed a lot in any particular way, you don't have to worry about your exposure. Once you set it up, you're good. And that's the incident light versus the reflected light. The incident light is what drives the seed, and the reflected light is what you're taking. And it doesn't matter whether it's, you're shooting into the sun, away from the sun, and so on. Your exposure will be about the same. And finally, we talked about processor limitations. Offload in complex situations, go manual with whatever you can, and still meet your intent. Okay, let's see. So going forward, most important part of making a photograph is determining your intent. And I hope some of this gives you an idea, and in terms of informing you on what your intent can be in terms of making that photograph, and you don't have to worry about what your camera's doing. Better is to inform your photographic intent with knowledge and skill with your camera settings and configuration. When you just, home with your camera or wherever, just take some shots, well, that's what my next action here is. Practice shooting with different settings and configurations. Do it anytime, anywhere, and explore the settings. Go too slow, go too fast with your shutter speed, open up, close down. Try extreme settings, push the normal, and evaluate what the effect is on your photos, particularly when you're practicing, when you don't care. And like anything creative, the more you apply yourself and practice, the better you'll become, and it'll show. So build your confidence and be set for your shot. This allows you to concentrate on what's the most important, and that's creating a photograph. We're really only limited by the depths of your own imagination and creativity. One of my favorite photographers, Jared Lloyd. And with that, questions?
Tom, that was outstanding. The comments in the chat, which I'll send you, were phenomenal. Everyone was quite grateful and loved your talk. Several asked if you would mind sharing the PDF of your slides, even though it is a recorded session.
Yeah, I'll get that to you, Vince, and you can
Give those
post
to me, Ginny, and
Yeah.
I can put them as a link in the
right.
in the newsletter.